today we're doing lesson 5, and we get to the long-awaited Black Death. So before we get to that, we need to mention what's going on, right? Unfortunately, we've had a series of different things that lead to really bad times. Really cold winters, rainy summers. That bad weather leads to bad crops, right? They either rot in the fields if it's too rainy. A lot of diseases are spread, livestock die. And so, of course, there's not going to be enough food then for people because of the bad crops. And there starts to be a famine. Okay, and so that famine, of course, is going to lead to a lot of people dying from starvation. And then, of course, also comes the plague. So in the 1300s, we have this particular plague was nicknamed the Black Death. We know there's different kinds of plagues, and this is most likely the bubonic plague. It's called the Black Death because of people would develop these boils and they would be blackened. And so that's because of you could clearly see that often the boils had like pus coming out, and it was really gross. So we know now that this kind of disease, this plague, is passed through bacteria, which was from the fleas. And the fleas, they believe, were carried on rats. And rats were common throughout the Middle Ages, and especially with the increase of trade through trade caravans, either overland on the Silk Road or very often on ships. And unfortunately, then the disease spread throughout all of Europe very quickly because of the trade. They do believe it started in China and spread throughout there first, killed about half of the Chinese population. And then, of course, you can see on the map here that it spreads all throughout, Asia and, of course, eventually Europe. So about a half of Europe died too from the plague, okay? So the people, of course, at the time did not understand the real reasons, right, for how it was spread, not having that scientific knowledge. So they thought God was punishing them a lot of the time, right? Again, throughout history, right, Jews are blamed, must be their fault. There are many areas where they would kick the Jews out of their country, right? That will help save them. Germans did that, for example. Notice that is way before, right? Like which most of you think of, like World War II. And of course, having so many people die is going to have a big impact on the economy. So you have kind of an interesting thing happen. So you have less people to work because people are dying. The workers, though, are in high demand, right? So they actually could get paid a little bit more. So there you see a weakening of feudalism, right? Because people don't have to rely on other people. They can pay rent, and they don't have to say they'll work for the Lord, right? And if you were a serf, maybe you're more in need now, and so you can get more rights for yourself, right? So there was some changes to society because of that. The other thing is food prices are going to actually go way down because the food supply is still there, but now there's less people to eat it. So it messes with the economy, right? So we see a big weakening in feudalism overall. Okay, and then other problems. There's a lot of problems in the late Middle Ages. There's conflicts going on in the church. There's another great schism, a division about church leaders arguing amongst themselves who's the rightful pope, and it went on for quite a while. and it basically, they did end up solving it, but not before it caused a major division. Also, the kings, of course, are all, challenging the popes, right? This has been an ongoing thing where the popes and the kings are vying for power, and so a lot of them, they're having power struggles. And also, remember, we talked about how the church has seemed like they are focusing on wealth and power, and so a lot of people are thinking the church is corrupt, and so there's a lot of problems going on in the church itself too. Okay, and then there's also problems going on a lot between England and France. So throughout this period, for quite a while, France has been controlled often by English kings. And of course, the French want more independence. They want to go and, make their own empire, and they don't like the English controlling them. So there's a big fight. The Hundred Years' War basically is by the King of England, King Edward III at the time, says, that France is ours, and he invades to make sure that he has it. And of course, the French are not wanting him to have it, and they want to rule themselves. And so there's a war for about 100 years. This is the famous war that Joan of Arc was part of. You may have heard of her. She basically, this is going to be the short story, but basically she is no one, right? She's a 17-year-old poor French girl. She comes to the king, or the prince at the time, Charles, and says, I hear, voices from the saints are telling me that I'm supposed to help you, and we're going to win if I do. And basically convinces her that she knows, she predicts some things that do end up happening. So basically convinces that she needs to go with and help with this fight. Make a long story short, basically they start doing well. They make a treaty for a while, and then eventually the English invade and catch her, and she is eventually burned at the stake for heresy. They say she's a witch, right? She talked about hearing voices and things, and of course she also is going to battle and stuff that's not as appropriate for women, right? And so that's the short story for Joan of Arc. So she's convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. And then years later, they actually retry her after her death. And they decide, she was actually innocent. And therefore now she's considered a saint because she died for her cause. And so that's an interesting story about Joan of Arc. Okay, so long story short, the English are very bitter, let's say, about losing to the French. And there's a lot of interior struggles in England in the in the 400s, later 400s. And so that's called the War of the Roses. It's a civil war, right? It's all in England. Again, we're not going to go too much in detail, but the short of it is the winner, Henry Tudor, who becomes King Henry VII, wins the War of the Roses. So there's a lot of internal struggles there too. Okay, we're going through quite a bit of history in a short amount of time. This is a whole topic just in itself. All right, and then the other big thing is, remember how we've been having ongoing conflict with the Muslims, right, and the Christians. So remember that the Muslims have, all this time in the Middle Ages, controlled what they call the Iberian Peninsula. Basically, remember that's the peninsula with Spain and Portugal, right? So that's where they controlled. Remember we had talked about how there's a lot of centers of learning there, and remember there's been ongoing problems with the Christians not wanting the Muslims and trying to kick them out, right? So this is another time period where they're trying to reconquer. It's called literally the Reconquista, right? Reconquer the Muslims. And for a while they do. There's 3 Christian kingdoms at this time, Portugal, Castile, and Aragon. And they only left one area that was still Muslim, Granada. And so they really want to get rid of that last one. And so they marry 2 together. So the Prince Ferdinand of Aragon and Princess Isabella of Castile, they actually marry. And again, remember, it's like a political thing, not, not a love thing. And so they are combining their 2 powerful kingdoms together, and they have going to be the Catholic country of Spain. And so they think it's very important to, make Catholicism the one true religion. So when they take over, there is a huge upsurgence of another Inquisition. It's called the Spanish Inquisition this time. And so it's the same idea of having those people brought to trial and saying that they are not good Christians. And the backstory, really what this was, is ethnic cleansing, because in this area that they've taken over, there are a lot of Jews. And back when it was under the Muslims, the Jews have been pretty much allowed to live there, without a problem. And so when the Christians took over, of course, remember, there's a long history and they persecute them. And they basically at first said, you have to become Christian. And so, of course, some do, right? Because you kind of have to. But remember, and they're probably right, that they thought that the Jews were probably secretly still Jewish, right? And so they wanted to, prove that they're not really being Christian, and honestly just put enough pressure on them and force them out, right? And so there's basically they hugely go after them. The Spanish Inquisition is even more bloody and terrible than the previous ones we talked about. They torture so many people and kick out a lot of Jews. 1492, they finally say the rest of them have to leave, right? If you're not really a real Christian, you got to leave. And of course, right, it was very dangerous to stay, right? Because even if you say you're Christian, this could happen to you. So basically the same thing ends up happening when they finally do conquer Granada. They do the same thing to the Muslims. Basically, like, if you're not Christian, you better leave. And so a lot of Muslims, didn't want to take that chance either. And so a lot of them left and moved to North Africa.